My name is Harman Smith, and I am a doctor in Metroidology. I have played these games, I have studied them, and I know more about the culture behind them than anybody else on the planet. And I can tell you for a fact that the people complaining about Metroid Prime 4 Beyond are not Metroid fans, never were Metroid fans, and only advocated for this series out of this idea, this misconception that this was some big AAA products made for the dude bro audience. They supported Metroid Prime. They loved Metroid Prime because they thought it was a first person shooter. And when Metroid Prime 4 Beyond came out and was not that, a lot of these dudes were just upset and angry. Like, how dare this be structured like a Nintendo game? How dare Samus not talk? Things that real fans wouldn't even bat an eye at are considered this huge controversial thing among the Pretendo Metroid community. And today, during my review of Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, I am going to emphasize just why this line of thinking is completely ridiculous. Now that I have finished Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, it really does need to be emphasized that pretty much everything you've been told about this game is not true. Right now, you're seeing a lot of people seething about the green emerald thing, but I can tell you that if you're doing it the way you're supposed to, collecting emeralds throughout the game, it is a complete non issue. And the same could be said for pretty much every major criticism that people have towards this game. You have people complaining about the enemy variety. You have people complaining about the locations, the desert, the story. Basically, all of them amount to the the critic not being a fan of the Metroid Prime games, because it's very interesting seeing the perspective of hardcore Metroid Prime fans, people who stuck around for Metroid Prime 1, for 2, for 3, for Hunters, for Federation Force, and also playing the 2D games versus a lot of these people who really come off as if they're not familiar with the Metroid Prime si- uh, games at all. And that really does need to be explored more, because I'm seeing a lot of people like argue this game has a very poor story, that it's not all that well told, that the characters aren't interesting. And I would very heavily disagree with that. The story in this game is told entirely through scan logs. If you're not paying attention to the setting, it is very easy to miss a lot of essential lore, to the point where, honestly, it feels like most people are blasting through this game, not processing it all, and making all these really wild accusations, particularly about like the NPC characters and about their role in the story. Because by the end, I was very, very surprised with how much I found myself invested in the cast and what ended up happening to them. Like, not to give it away, but the ending to this game is positively brutal and is one of like, I think one of the best endings to any Metroid game ever. I think at the very least this is better than anything we've ever seen in Metroid Prime. And of course, like, the ending to Super Metroid is iconic, but like, this very well may come as a close second or even better in a lot of ways. It's very interesting to think about stuff like that, that this game has so much going for it and yet is held back by just a handful of things that have been blown out of proportion. For starters, I keep seeing people complain about the combat and the way the game works. Like, I've seen a lot of people insist that this game doesn't innovate or change things at all from the original Metroid Prime games, and that is pretty clearly not true. Like, the enemy AI is way better. You have more utility, you can do more things to them. Winning this game in a lot of cases involves a lot more than simply just shooting something a lot. Like, I was surprised with how, like, how often you had to like dodge these, point blank attacks, or like how much variety of things like bosses could do in this. Like, it was really crazy playing this and kind of thinking to myself that, like, wow, I think the overall combat in this is actually the best in any Metroid game. There were sequences in this game that were really well thought out and interesting, and I was just like, wow, this has the best level design of any Metroid Prime game. But at the same time, when the game doesn't work, when it does feel lazy, when it does feel rushed, it does really severely hamper your experience. Like, the Great Mine in particular is terrible. It's so boring. It doesn't do a lot for the characters. It just sets everyone up for this like weird, like, uh fake out death sequences that don't really go anywhere. Like, it was really strange playing the Great Mine because for it felt like the final level in a lot of ways. And then there's like, the final boss after that, but like just the setup to it and how they utilized it and what you did in the mine, it was just like very repetitive and boring, right? The worst area in the game by far, but everything leading up to that moment was great. Everything after it was great. I find myself like thinking that, that entire experience kind of made me realize that this game does have absolute highs when it comes to Metroid Prime, but it also has unbearable lows. Like, it is, I think, interesting to think of this game as having a lot of high points for the franchise, but when it hits its low points, it is the worst it's ever been. And they don't last long. They're not too prevalent. They're not too annoying. They don't hamper the overall excellent experience, but they do need to be talked about. Like, this game does feel like it was rushed. Like, I do think the characters should have had more story to them. I think they should have been doing more things. I think like there should have been like more of this feeling that like they were doing their own thing like outside of what you were accomplishing. Like at a certain point, like especially towards the ending, like they do really step up in a big way, and you really do start liking and appreciating them. But at the same time, like throughout the game as a whole, like their implementation just feels very, very limited. And it's very unfortunate to say that because when you look at it objectively as a fan, these are the best Galactic Federation troopers we've ever seen. When you look at these guys, like they all have like unique backgrounds, personalities, they all use different weapons, have different specialties, contribute to the plot in different ways. There's so many examples of that like throughout the entire thing. And yet, like at the same time, a lot of people are rightfully pointing out the fact that these characters aren't nearly as interesting as they should be. That there are games that do this kind of dynamic better and have, a more fleshed out, setting and world. And my belief is that like Metroid Prime 4 has evolved the Galactic Federation like far past like what they were originally intended to be. But at the same time, there is this very real feeling that like other IPs do this better. And that is like a big major point of contention that I've been seeing a lot of people do is that like, well, Halo does this better. Well, Dead Space does it better. And that mindset, I think, is what kind of gives the whole game away. The people who are really genuinely upset about this game existing and how it plays and its structure, like these are people who grew up playing Halo, who grew up as like with these super mainstream casualized first person shooter franchises and can't handle the fact that Metroid Prime by its nature is a lot more niche. It's a lot more methodical. It's a lot more like geared towards a hardcore audience. Like everybody I've seen playing about this game doesn't seem to understand what it's setting out to do and why it had very deliberate design decisions. Like for example, I've seen so many people like complain about the the boss fights in these games. In any other game, you could just shoot the thing until it dies, but in Metroid Prime, you're supposed to methodically take it out in a very specific way. It takes a lot more skill and patience to beat a boss in Metroid Prime than it would in any like first-person shooter franchise, right? But for a lot of people, that just comes off as like a weird dated design decision. And I keep seeing that term thrown around a lot, dated. You know, like I keep seeing people say that this game feels like it could have come out of the 2000s. And considering how we live in a gaming industry where everybody insists that gaming in the 2000s was way better than what it was now, I find that to be a very curious statement to make. Like, are these people acknowledging that Metroid Prime 4 is in fact better than the games we're getting today? Like, I can tell you for a fact that Metroid Prime 4, it's better than The Last of Us Part 2, it's better than Cyberpunk 2077, it's better than Ghost of Yotoi, it's better than Death Stranding 2. Like, there have been Dragon's Dogma 2, Monster Hunter Wilds. There have been endless amounts of sequels that have come out in the past couple of years that have been unbearably disappointing and terrible, and yet Metroid Prime is the one that gets backlash. When you really start digging into why people are upset with Metroid Prime 4, you're hit with all these complaints about Samus being a silent protagonist. You get hit with complaints about there not being a story. You get hit with complaints about the typical Metroid structure. You have guys saying the game is too linear and too unlinear at the same time. Like, you have people making all these weird statements that basically amount to the fact that Metroid is not and never has been a AAA IP targeted towards a mass audience, but is instead a niche video game designed for a specific kind of person. And that is the huge discrepancy we're seeing with Metroid Prime 4, is that the AAA shills are upset that something like this exists. You know, they are upset that Metroid Prime 4 does not look and play exactly like Halo, and they are going to complain about it. And this is, in fact, something that we've seen from this franchise since the very beginning. You know, like, people love saying that, like, Prime 2 and 3 were very controversial when they came out, and that is true. Absolutely, that's true. But what people forget is that the same could be said for Metroid Prime 1. A lot of Halo players sneered at Metroid Prime for not having multiplayer, for not being a real first person shooter, for not having, like, you know, the cool military space marine theme. Like, you know, at the time, Halo was this huge cultural phenomenon and Metroid was this niche thing. And yet, Metroid is the one that was remembered as a classic, the one that's gone on to be one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time. And with this specific release, I have to posit the possibility that this was done for the wrong reasons. Like, people did not love Metroid Prime because it was such a great game. They liked it because they saw it as a game that where Nintendo grew up. That's what everyone always talks about when it comes to Metroid Prime. That's what everybody loves about it. That's what everyone remembers. Like, the idea that this game was super realistic and it was mature and it had a gun in it and it was just this amazing looking game. Like, nobody really talks about the boss fights or the structure or the lore unless you're like a hardcore fan. The simple fact of the matter is, the reason why Metroid Prime became so critically acclaimed and why people look back on it so fondly was because it created this illusion that Nintendo was moving towards developing games for a more mature audience, a more adult audience, and that over time retro studios would put out something that could compete with Halo. And of course that didn't actually happen. You know, of course not. But at the same time, that was the reasoning behind putting Metroid Prime on a pedestal. You know, the idea that this was a game for adults and that was something that we could look forward to coming from Nintendo as they put out a sea of endless kiddie nonsense. Like, that was why Metroid Prime was held in such high regard. It wasn't because it was such a good game. It was done out of this feeling that Nintendo needed something to target this demographic. And that's what's led the original Metroid Prime to be put on such a pedestal, even after 2 and 3 had much more of a middling response. Like, because at that point, people were game journals were able to more successfully damage control these games as they came out. It's very interesting, like, looking back at this and seeing just how many Metroid games have gone through this song and dance of people pretending to be the jaded hardcore fan and yet not knowing anything about the IP. How many times have we seen over this release cycle that, you know, Samus shouldn't talk and that there shouldn't be NPCs and there should be no cutscenes? And it's all like, this has all been like a series staple thing for decades at this point, to the point where like it really feels as if a lot of these people have not played a Metroid game since Super. It really comes off as if the bulk of like the vocal online Metroid fan base are people who stopped after Super Metroid. And a lot of, I'm not the first to point out this observation. Actually, maybe I was, because I've been talking about this since Federation Force came out, actually. But there seems to be this weird mindset among the community that Metroid is something it isn't. That this is a cool adult franchise for hardcore gamers, when that is not and never has been true. The real reason Metroid Prime 4 is so controversial is that a lot of people who play it are let down by the fact that this game isn't what they were sold as. People really went into this thinking this was going to be some major system seller for Switch 2, that this was going to be some huge deal. But in reality, Metroid is not and never has been that high selling of an IP. It's always been more of a niche thing. The simple fact of the matter is, like, this is not really a AAA product. I would put this game alongside more like titles like Luigi's Mansion 3 and Bayonetta 3, No More Heroes 3, games that are lower budget, like that are targeted more towards a dedicated audience as opposed to like a general audience. Like they're more in like the AA territory. Like calling this game AAA just because it's Metroid kind of ignores the reality of this franchise's situation, is that it's not mainstream. It never has been mainstream. And due to its design philosophy, it never will be mainstream. Like this is, it's shocking to me how many people have gone to bat for this idea that this game is such a massive disappointment, because one look at the Metacritic, which is constantly going up, one look at the reviews, one playthrough for yourself, and you start to realize very, very quickly that nothing that is being said about this game is true. It's kind of remarkable how much the community has lied about this game over the past several weeks. And it's, now that the game is actually out, we are seeing a bit of a course correction. And a lot of people are even acknowledging that the course correction is taking place. So, with that being said, all these negative reviews that we've seen regarding this release are going to completely implode by the end of the year. Like, I really do think Metroid Prime 4 is quite a bit better than every single game nominated for Game of the Year this year. And I feel like I won't be alone in saying that. Long term, Prime 4 is going to be held in much higher regard than I think a lot of people are willing to acknowledge. So now that we have completely debunked the criticism of this game, what can we say about the game itself? Like, what makes this work so well? First of all, I think this game sticks out due to having its very unique control scheme re-implemented from Metroid Prime 3. This is a game in which you strafe around the enemy and aim with the gyro, proving once again that motion controls are here to stay and that Nintendo is implementing them in ways that other first-person adventure games cannot even begin to fathom. It is incredibly satisfying moving around as Samus, waving your arm around and shooting anything that moves. And for a lot of the bosses, you have to shoot in very specific ways. And sometimes you have to be creative with your move set to overcome the enemies. And when it comes to like the general enemy variety, like they are kind of a bit limited. Like towards the end, you do get kind of sick of seeing Grievers, but like the actual combat itself is endlessly entertaining, and the boss fights are just very memorable, very fun, and very distinct from one another. Like you will be fighting a whole range of crazy bosses all the way up until the end, leading up into what I feel may be the second best final boss in the series. I think still that the original Metroid Prime still kind of tops it because of just how memorable and iconic it was. But, this one is a close second with a really good emotional payoff. And that's one of the things about this game that I think a lot of people are sleeping on right now. Like, the ending is just phenomenal. If you haven't beaten this game yet, definitely be sure to check that out. But yeah, like this game is just oozing with like creativity, with great level design, and just all of these things that just really get your heart racing. There's this really cool escape sequence, like about halfway through, that's honestly one of the most memorable moments in any Metroid game ever. Like usually they wait towards the end or the beginning to do an escape sequence, but here you do it about halfway through and it comes out of nowhere, and yet it's so well implemented and so fun and so exciting that like it really sticks out as a high point in the game. You have all these really fun, like, puzzles to solve, all these really interesting mechanics. Telekinesis is interesting. Your control beam is interesting. Um, I will say, like, one of the disappointing games things about this game is how limited the power up system actually is. Because a lot of times, actually, yeah, most of the power ups in this game are just slightly better versions of what we had already. So you get a boost ball. Okay, you get the boost ball, but you also get this ability to go along like psychic tracks that just kind of exist for some reason. You get the spider ball and you get the ability to go along psychic tracks that appear out of nowhere. You get the space jump and you get the ability to jump on psychic platforms that appear out of nowhere. Right? Like it's interesting that they tried to expand these moves in certain ways, and there's a handful of interesting things about them. Like, for example, you can like use telekinesis to pick up power bombs and then throw them at enemies, right? There's like semblances of good ideas there, but it just feels like it's not as fleshed out as it should be. For example, like I found myself entering morph ball mode and fighting bosses, I think, a lot more than I did in most previous Prime games. Like, and usually what would happen is that like I would try to just get back to the first person view as quickly as possible, because like, like the morph ball takes a while to use. It's very limited. Like, like you use it so often in this to like dodge attacks and things like that. I kind of wished that the morph ball transformation was faster in this game. It was seamless in the original Prime, and they didn't really improve it that much here. But honestly, with how it's utilized in some of the boss encounters, like when you're ducking under laser beams and stuff like that, like it really should have been like radically improved for this game. Like Samus should be like running around, like morphing into the morph ball in like a split second and then just darting out of the way. Like that was something I found myself thinking a lot lately playing this, is that like, why is Samus so slow? Like, in a world like a post Doom Eternal world, I feel like, yeah, we can play FPS games like at a higher speed. It's weird to me that the game still feels like it's paced like a GameCube game. Why couldn't she have like a more expanded combat repertoire? I found myself wishing that like we had the counter mechanic from Dread, or that we had like some cool new interesting power-ups, but in a lot of ways it feels very samey to the original Prime. And considering how long this took to come out, like for a lot of people that's kind of disappointing, but considering the last Prime game was Federation Force, which was radically different, I do think it works for this specific installment, but it does need to be understood that we do need to address this as an issue, that we do need more interesting power-ups going forward. I think that's honestly like my big complaint with this game, is how the power-ups were handled. Secondly, for a heavily marketed feature, the bike isn't that interesting. Combat isn't useful in it. You don't use it in a lot of situations. Like, I'm very confused about why Nintendo wanted to put Samus on a bike. Like I just feel almost like it would have made more sense to just go back to base in between missions and then just hit a level select screen to go where you want to go. Like the desert just feels completely pointless. Like it really feels as if it easily could have been cut out and they could have added like another fully fledged area in there. Like I don't understand what purpose the desert serves. There are things in the desert that are interesting, lots of really interesting puzzles. There's hidden objects. There's a really, really good boss fight. But at the same time, like it's not fleshed out or interesting enough for what it is. Like it feels like they put all these resources into the desert and yet like they couldn't make it memorable or fun. And it's far from bad. I actually found like, cruising around in it kind of relaxing. But at the same time, it's not good either. It's not the main game. It's a lot like, the overworld in Shadow of the Colossus or like the overworld in No More Heroes where you're kind of just going through it to get to your destination. And for a certain kind of person, that's probably fine. Like again, I am exactly that kind of person, but I do 100% like understand why a lot of people would have an issue with this. Like if you're gonna put Samus on a bike, have her do something on the bike. I don't understand why this was so complicated. Like if they didn't have any good ideas for the bike, why exactly was it in there? Like so she could do the Acura slide? Like come on. It was definitely kind of disappointing. I didn't expect to like the bike, but it was probably the worst gameplay thing there was. I was so confused about some aspects of it, right? Because you have to like it just feels like it's supposed to be this huge like instrumental part of the lore, and yet even now that I finished it, I don't understand its significance or like why we used it or like where it came from. Like it's like it's just kind of there. Like the most impressive power up Samus has ever acquired on her adventures is basically a motorbike. It's just it's just very frustrating, and really should be condemned as like and a really good example as to why Nintendo shouldn't shove in new gimmicks to things with no rhyme or reason. This is a very good example of that. And I honestly feel as if considering how Federation Force was received, considering how games like Luigi's Mansion 2 were received, Nintendo's apprehensive about having level select screens in games because for a lot of people, like if a game doesn't have open world, it's not worth checking out. Like people find that like immersive, and it's like the most important thing for a lot of people. So like putting like creating the illusion of an open world in Metroid Prime 4 was to like satiate those kind of people, but I feel like Metroid doesn't really need to appease those kind of people, and that like they should have just gone ahead with a level select screen. And that's something that we really should need to be vocal about. Especially now that I'm like playing Luigi's Mansion 2 again and realizing it's my favorite Luigi's Mansion game. We need to stop complaining about level select screens. This was a perfect opportunity to utilize the level select screen, get rid of the desert, and just have this massively improved experience. And yet, like, they didn't do it probably to placate, like, just a handful of people who would have spurred out otherwise. And that's something that I find myself very frustrated with. Like they should be able to make games with level select screens if it suits the design better. And this is a really good example of a game that would have benefited from a level select screen. Now, when it comes to other things like the art direction and the music, this is probably one of the best looking Metroid Prime games. When this game looks good, it looks very good. When the music gets pumping, it's really gets pumping. I thought they got a new composer for this because the soundtrack felt so different, but apparently he stepped up his game for this one because there have been so many times where I've just been like blown away by some of the bombastic soundtracks in this game. It really feels quite a bit different than the more ambient style used in Super and Prime. It feels radically different, and unlike something like Breath of the Wild, in which the music is the worst part, I would argue the music in this is probably some of the best in the series. Obviously, I'll have to go back to older Metroid Prime games and like verify that. But there were a lot of times playing through this that I was really taken aback by how good the soundtrack actually was. Like the final boss theme was awesome. There's just so much to like about this game, and the visuals. Okay, playing on a Switch 2, I was shocked by just how amazing the effects were. Things like the lightning strikes in Vault Forge, and just some of the in depth like the melting of the ice in Ice Belt when you turn the power back on. Like there's so much to this game that just feels like it has so much thought and consideration put into it. Like I actually saw like a Donkey's video on this, and I was kind of surprised. They have insects carrying around leaves, like realistically in Fury Green, and that's not an effect I would have noticed or cared about. But at the same time, they put the effort to do that, and that level of quality for this game in a relatively minor tutorial area is should be commended. It's really interesting seeing just how much thought and consideration they put into the level design, into the lore, into the world. It is really impressive just how visually distinct this is and how this manages to kind of feel like a new take on Metroid Prime and feel radically different than other first person adventure games like it. In conclusion, there are things you can criticize Metroid Prime for, like there are a lot of things you can talk about that could have been better or could have been improved with more time. Like I definitely think they should have taken another year to polish up the plot, the characters, the desert thing. Like there's a lot of things they could have done to improve the overall experience, but they probably did put this out just because the Switch 2 was coming out and they wanted to start fresh on Metroid Prime 5. That's kind of my mindset on this at this stage is that the reason why this game feels kind of s- is made the way it is because this very much is a Switch 1 game, similar to like Pokemon Legends ZA in that respect. And that doesn't make the game bad at all, but it really is like Nintendo is looking to move ahead with the next major project, and they wanted to get this out as soon as possible. And what we got was something very impressive with a lot of potential. But as it turns out, it really did need another year or so. And we don't know exactly what was happening behind the scenes yet. And I'm not sure we ever will. But at the same time, I do hope everyone has learned a valuable lesson from all this. Like, don't pressure Nintendo to make a game that they're not in a position to make. Okay, they had to rebuild Retro Studios from scratch. They had to restart development, and in the end, they had to put out a rush product. And it's a miracle the game is as good as it is, considering the circumstances regarding the development of it. But it does need to be said that there was no reason to get insistent that like we needed a new Metroid Prime now. You know, like it was something that I felt just didn't really sit right with me. I did feel like the Metroid Prime trilogy was over, and I feel as if it probably would have been a good idea to consider making a completely new original kind of 3D Metroid. But, for what it is, Prime 4 is fantastic and I really enjoyed my time with it. I highly recommend this amazing game.